to you tonight. I'm just gonna make my way to the city of light, where my heart can beat with the nightlife.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karuna. So we're actually going to, I think, continue on with this discussion. So I'd like to invite all the panel members for the ATI to come up and sit down, and we would like to have a conversation around some of these engagement efforts more broadly around this clinical trial landscape. And just so people know, I'm Jessica Salzwedel. I am a senior program manager at AVAC. And the community engagement coordinator actually for 3 Martin Delaney collaboratories, PAVE, which focuses on pediatrics, I4C, and REACH as well. And I'm gonna have panel members introduce themselves. So once they get settled, I'll see who's at the start of the table. So it's gonna be Udom. So Udom, I would like everybody to just give a quick introduction on your name and sort of where you're coming from in the world, and then we'll get started. So Udom, we'll start with you.
I'm Udom Likhitwonnawut from Chiang Mai, Thailand, and I participate in the Q study in Bangkok, Interruptions.
Great, Michele.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Michele Andrasik, and I'm the Director of Social Behavioral Science and Community Engagement for the HIV Vaccine Trials Network.
And I'm her partner in crime, Gail Broder. I'm the Associate Director for Social Behavioral Science and Community Engagement at the HVTN.
Great.
Hi, my name is Krista. I'm an infectious disease physician and the clinical director of the FRESH acute HIV cohort, where we're currently conducting a BNAB combination trial with an ATI in South Africa.
And I'm Sikwese from AfroCAB Treatment Access Partnership, and I'm based in Zambia.
Great, thank you. And so we really wanted to have this panel because, as Liz and Richard showed earlier, there are 34 current trials that have this analytical treatment interruption, and this is something that we're seeing more pop up as well in the future. So wanted to begin, to have these conversations. And I kind of want to pick up on where we left off by starting with, how do we balance the opportunity for participant control with safety risks? And I'd love to maybe start with Michele and Gail to talk about how did you, during these initial consultations, speak with communities about balancing that risk benefit, ratio with them?
Well, at first, I think it's important to note that we do this across all of our trials. Safety is, at the center of everything that we do, and in all of our community consultations, exploring potential risks and concerns, and really ensuring that we are acting sort of proactively to ensure that people can join the trials with the least amount of risk. And we have, safety monitoring in place across all of our trials as well. We have an entire safety team that is thinking about all of these things, in parallel to our community consultations. And I'll let Gail talk a bit more about the actual, what happened at the consultations as she was there.
Yeah. So, as Shelley described, we have held several different consultation meetings in the US, in South Africa, in Peru as well. And actually, I went back and dug out, I have all the notes from them. If anybody wants to see that, including photographs of the flip chart pages in Spanish that we'll have to come back and translate for those of us who are not Spanish speakers. But what I thought was sort of interesting when I went back to sort of refresh my memory about how did these consultations go, we had put together kind of a list of questions to generate the discussion. And so those included a whole range of questions around what were the concerns about compensation and reimbursement for study visits, recognizing that visits were going to be happening with increased frequency. And so was there a point at which compensation became coercive because people were coming in so often that it could amount to a lot of money? How do we, how should we address that in the consent process? We then went to a set of questions around partnering with primary healthcare providers. Who should have the responsibility for those interactions? Should be the participants themselves, the study staff, and how to engage the primary provider when the time for restart occurred, so that there was good communication between the research team and someone's primary care resources. We talked about the need for different kinds of community engagement and messaging and confidentiality. So what role was there for sort of wider community engagement versus just this limited group of people who were eligible because of their participation in the parent study? We looked at, there was a whole range of talk about that. But I guess, Jessica, to your point, I think, again, a lot of it came down to what Shelley described, this sort of guided, structured process during the consent to really help somebody sort of walk through and say, okay, let me just assess my own values and then see how those values sync up to the demands of the study. And helping people really take a very thoughtful, considered approach to that.
For those on the line, I want to move to Krista, and before I ask you your question, I'm going to ask, can you just give a very brief overview of the FRESH trial that's ongoing, just because people may not know about it?
Sure. The FRESH trial is sponsored by Gilead Sciences. It began enrolling in August of this past year. It is on the .gov website. It was posted in March, so you can get details of it there. The trial has an enrollment aim of 25 women from the FRESH cohort. All women from the FRESH cohort were enrolled in a program that had very frequent HIV monitoring to pick up acute infection during PVIC stage 1 and initiate immediate treatment in 24 hours of detectable HIV RNA. So the candidates for the trial would have been very suppressed very early and had minimal viral exposure. The trial itself is a combination of two barley neutralizing antibodies, the young cousin, BRCO7-523LS, CAP256, as well as a TLR7 agonist developed by Gilead, which is mesenterimod.
And I'm wondering if you could just talk to us a little bit about what are your thoughts about the variability and quality of community engagement in HIV cure research?
Thanks for asking. My hair is blown back by what you guys have done and you were able to do with network. And I would caution anyone who's been invested in because without that being a mandate, the local ethics boards, international IRBs don't necessarily understand cure research or particularly ATI studies, insofar as they would even know where to begin to say what to require. So I would love to see some of what you've done in the AMP trial be used as a guideline to require sponsors and investigators to implement community engagement, because without that requirement, you can put a line on the budget to say for community engagement. That doesn't mean we're going to do it, because investigators, especially such as myself, we're not hardwired for community engagement care. We're hardwired for biological endpoints and follow the protocol. So doing that kind of work, I think that we need more than that. We need a framework that requires we do that work, or we won't do it. So yeah, I'm super impressed with the accomplishment.
And I want to maybe stay you for a second and then go with Kelly. I wonder if we could talk about, if U equals U is such a strong message everywhere. And in ATI trials, we're asking people to go off therapy, which can be difficult to reconcile with this U equals U message. So as much as you maybe can, Krista, kind of talk about love to understand how you are thinking about this U equals U message within ATI trial and how you're thinking about it within this trial. And then I'd love to go to Kelly to think about how do we reconcile that with the community writ large?
So we did gradually get involved really very early. When we began getting engaging the community, we also engaged without the requirement to be engaged. So we got pretty elective what we did. So we began meeting with communities around language and risks that they anticipated before there ever was a trial. Our focus really was on them stopping their drugs if they didn't want to. And I think we're kind of misplacing where our concern should be. I think that our concern and consideration should be the majority are probably going to read them. I think we should be focusing on restarting avoiding adherence when we do that, because it's, you know, we explain it's not a direct adherence. That's what it is with the research site. At home, it's a drug holiday. It's structured, it's analytic, it's a holiday. And you get very used to very rapidly not taking your drugs. It's a long process to get used to taking drugs every day. You have to get that habit, but when you stop taking it, that's 5 seconds. So I think we started comparing the content, how they the potential for
Great. So your thoughts on this whole idea again, the U equals U is for example this idea that you got this idea.
Absolutely. I think when you go to facilities like that, one of the things you come across, a lot of people not very expressed that are actually just getting the treatment. And there is in some countries, we're able to 95%. We struggle to in some way that okay, it was technical is and survival. So we're now going and tell them whatever. Or whatever. From yes, and then Krista so right. From our perspective, it would get like that. And contrary to the I suspect that if you're very eager to get off their drugs, will be relieved to get off their drugs, and more or less give them some attention. And so my question is about once you get to use their life. Krista's question is so important. How do you be able to get these people in care, keep them in care, and keep them adherence? You know, so it's a. I have always avoided because of those hard questions, and my organization, I think, and my organization once how many got the whole community. Because perhaps it was premature. This that is a stuff. This that is
yeah, well, when I muted them, that's the whole problem. So it's muted. These are the muted. The sound, I think it has to be on the
right now.
So I feel like I need to move back closer to them. Like, no, there's no connection.
And the dialogue Ethiopia but absolutely correct. Yes, I probably have more questions. But absolutely correct. I think I probably have more questions for you than any suggestions, because that is a very challenging scenario to find ourselves. But I think this is a kind of research.
If I could add more, so that whole tension between equals you and being off medication definitely came up in our consultation as well. And it ended up being a specific element of the consent form and in our consent video. I want to remind you that this means that U equals U won't apply to you because you will, you should expect that you are going to have a viral load that is transmissible again. So we talked about that in the African study in particular with regard to if you're thinking of, as Shelley mentioned, if you're thinking about having a child, there's, the potential to transmit to your infant and all of the protections that one needs to take in that regard. But equally so in the Americas and in Africa, we actually made a PrEP for partners available if people enrolled in the ATI had a partner who would be interested in using PrEP during that period when someone was transmissible again. We had a program in place to make that available to them.
Sorry, I think I didn't forget to address the question. Okay, I think one of the things we did discuss and if you are introducing in the particular country, it's something you may have to still consider due consent. That is not just the participants by themselves. Maybe it's keep up on a list when they made for whatever reason. But some of our people say, look, if my partner is going to do a study, I want to make sure I was seduced individually, almost like one joke where we heard it was, it's almost like we have a joint account and we leave both signatures on it, and not just because they're exposed. And so this is something when we think about your question.
Yeah, and this is a great point, and I wanted to bring up the conversation. Thailand and the RV-144 studies are some of the earliest ATI or in this juror space, early ATI studies, and it also has a lot of social science research. And one of the things that happened in these studies, which is the RV-144, is a cohort of individuals or men who have sex with men, and also transgender women who are treated very early in acute infection, very similar to the fresh cohort, and they have undergone some treatment interruption studies as well in these individuals in this cohort. And it has a very robust social science component. And one of the things we learned about that is that research, we don't always know what we don't know, and that can be hard in an informed consent to write. There's the things that we know, there's the things we know we don't know, and then there's this whole bucket of things we don't know we don't know. And how do we write that, and how do we build trusting relationships when we don't know what we don't know? And so, Udom, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the perhaps that was done in Thailand, especially around this idea of trust building with some of these cohorts of individuals in the Thailand province.
Yes, like you said, Jessica, in Thailand, the HIV, the cohort for HIV cure, they're early treated. And they just a younger generation, they get treated really well. They have been followed up really well by research team, So they have access to treatment right away. So have no need to disclose themselves, no need to interact with all the people. Because carry on with their normal life. Everything still fine at the same time. They got first-rate treatment on the top-notch clinic in Bangkok, Thailand. So from their personal experience, they have no need to interact with anyone. They don't have to disclose themselves. They don't even talk to fellow cohort. Even though they might suspect that this particular person also come to the clinic as well, but they don't interact with each other because of stigma, right? So no need to talk to anyone, no need to disclose that they're HIV, or you have to pretend that they're not interested in HIV, otherwise they will draw attention to themselves, right? So it's really hard to to reach out to these people. What we have to do is just just put the information out there about HIV, about ATI, and hopefully it will reach they will reach them. They will get access. So our part, our action by the researcher or the community advocate, it's pretty much passive. We have to put information out there and wait for them to initiate the contact. But again, they also for participants really because they've been involved with they've been have relationship with researcher for a long time before HVTN start, right? Before they start to study from this is the follow-up cohort. So the relationship is really strong. They will have a positive experience with healthcare service through that setting. But at the same time, they know that outside this setting, we have pretty much bad experience, worse. So that's why relationship quite strong. And I think indirectly they will in depth to researcher as well. They know that depend on researcher to get this kind of treatment, not unlike everyone else. So and Thai traditional also we respect teacher, do respect doctor, do respect government officials. So there won't be any question. And a lot of people have ATI concern about side effects of the experimental agents. I talked to one participant. He said he's not concerned at all. He said their viral load rebound up to more than 100,000 copies. For as long he doesn't care, because he have completely trust in researcher that he take really well.
I think that's sort of theme that everybody isn't bad around, right? But also I think helps people feel confident and going off of therapy, which was the initial thought of the concern. I'm going to ask one more question, then I recognize that there are some audience questions, and I'm sure some online question. But currently, and this is, I'm going to ask everybody this question, but currently there are no biomarkers that we can look at who's going to control and who's not. And so when we think about TIs, interventions, not all, but some will require a placebo. And in the study, saw people who got placebo, the way to TIs. So how do you talk about the use of a placebo control in a TI or the way that study? And I'm wondering if everybody can just give some general thoughts about that, some of the strategies and communities or things to do that.
I think in AMP, it was a bit of a unique situation because the parent AMP study had not yet been unblinded at the time that the ATI study was beginning. So placebo questions, but that actually shaped the AMP ATI study in Africa, where the research objectives were different than the sibling study in the Americas. Because as Shelley described, one of the research questions then became this idea of what differences do we see just based on early initiation of ART, and that would not necessarily have whether you placebo or whether you got the study antibody. Because anybody who took part perfectly. So I don't think we've had to really tackle that entirely just yet. But I think we're prepared to ask those questions and do those consultations as study designs arise where that becomes relevant.
And I'm going to ask others to again, I think it's part of this idea of how do you
the first trial was not very small, 2A trial, observational, looking at feasibility and acceptability rather than efficacy. We are measuring the endpoints, time to treatment, etc. But we're not doing such a unusual or so rare, small number initiated treatment within detectable RNA that we wouldn't have sufficient numbers to both have a placebo arm along with the intervention arm. So similarly, if we were to have that luxury, to have enough people to enroll in a trial like that,
we'd have to put a lot of measures in place and get feedback about how we would communicate and prepare people for the possibility that they're not getting active interventional product.
I think maybe when I think about those challenges, I keep wondering what ethical questions arise if someone, in such instances. And I honestly, in all honesty, don't have even a clue how that might play. But ethical questions. And this is why, as we start thinking about getting IR, such interventions should be adopted widely in the near future. We start these engagements right now. These questions will be serious questions that need to be addressed upfront, rather than down the road.
I think the engagement beyond just potential participants, but with the regulators and ethics are going to be so in these projects, there is something potentially unknown things we're just unfamiliar. But I saw you kind of question earlier.
It occurred to me when we mentioned that somebody returning to being transmissible again, that it surprises me, and all the years I've been doing this work, I don't know what that number is.
I don't think we knew what to expect either. We just knew that we had sort of this idea, this theoretical expectation that people are going to go over their ARTs, and some number of them are going to have viral rebound, right? And Michele presented that data. So we didn't necessarily know, what was that number going to be? Was it going to be the CD4 count? Was it going to be the viral load? We just knew that was an expectation. So we wanted to prepare people for that idea that you are going to, it is a reasonable expectation to think that you are going to have viral rebound, and that you will get above whatever that level of being undetectable is. So it wasn't about a specific number, it was just this concept.
I think you might be right after the number of visibility. I just think that it's important to remember that undetectable below the detection, which is 200 copies, that is what you equals. So whatever it is above that, is the exact number you might need for transmission is not as important as the U equals U below the copy.
Okay. I want to add a little bit more here. I think before we talk about ATI, we have to look at the whole trial from participant perspective. ATI is just part of the whole thing. So we have to explain to them, the researcher have to explain to them what type of intervention we will have, for how long, and what type of thing they have to do during each clinical process. So ATI is just part of it. So we try to explain the entire process. I believe that only a few persons pay attention or understand what they can gain from the trial, maybe regular medical checkup, well taken care of, and have few personal relationship with doctor who can benefit you when you become ill, and all, etc. And ATI is just part of it, and following that also, and all this, scientific language from English word to Thai, when I explain in layperson term in Thai, do you understand this? Most of them will say, yeah, I understand, but it just went to just appear to do that. They're competent, they qualify for the trial. So I think we have to look through with all these factors before we decide whether they understand or consent or not.
Well, absolutely, and I think, you know, the partner bank account analogy is such a good one to think about, you know, who is involved in this research, in part of this process. I see Krista mic, and then Michael, I'm going to go to you.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I just want to comment specifically on that joint account issue. Things vary so much by region. And like you're saying, Ethiopia is not Zambia. It's not South Africa. It's not Thailand. In Thailand, one of the main concerns, if I understand, about ATI is the concern about becoming still converting because there are legal implications. You can lose your job if testing positive. That's not in place in South Africa. So the concern about still converting for these very treated patients wasn't something, but regarding consulting the partners, the community came forth very strongly in South Africa and said, please don't mandate disclosure and all these things. Inter-partner violence, even femicide, is a norm in South Africa. So they said, you can't put our young women at risk in this way. So mandating, whether it be double barrier contraceptives or mandating for partners would be dangerous for participants in a setting that has high gender-based violence.
So some of the questions on, I'm going to combine two of them because they were about the PrEP program. One was asking if you describe more specifically the PrEP for Partners program. They wanted to know if there are any PrEP referrals there. And then someone else was asking more specifically, in some countries PrEP is restricted to hot population. So how do you negotiate to have it in clinical setting or make it available to people who might not fit that description?
So I can talk about that last piece in the countries where the AMP study was on, and that referred to the parent study here. PrEP was already available. You're going back to that or not, it might have been my public sector registration projects, what have you, in the specifics of how we rolled out the partners program. I'm actually going to ask Michele because I have set it up. And so she's the most knowledgeable person to speak on this.
Sure.
If you want to get closer to these computers, because that's not working nearly as well as I wanted to do.
Okay.
Yeah, just right there. Good.
Okay. So we had the advantage of having established a PrEP referral program and PrEP access program in parent AMP studies for AMP participants who were vulnerable to HIV, highly vulnerable to HIV, but began the study without HIV. So we built on that system, and Gilead was happy to donate drug for some of the sites that could access it through that mechanism. Otherwise, MRD and other partners contributed to a fund that would make PrEP available as each site determined that would work best for them. We had 9 clinical research sites in the ATI, have 9 clinical research sites in the ATI. We have 9 different mechanisms of the way the PrEP is provided. What we provided could identify in that plan how they were going to facilitate PrEP. They would identify specific providers or centers, might be themselves, where they kind of took off their research hat and put on their clinician provider hat and provided PrEP that way. But we covered the costs of the drug, and we covered the costs of the laboratory monitoring. It was and is still very, very difficult to do this in a clinical research trial context because the partner is not a study participant. So there are some very clearly defined differences in that research context. So there was some taking off the investigator hat, putting on the provider hat, and part of the plan. I do want to add, we've had 0 partners take us up on this. 0. And that's true globally. We also have very low rates of the women participants in the AMP study.
So I say that I think that's actually crucial for us to recognize where the field is right now and what user demand is for the tools that we're providing. And I guess I'll just put on my hat and say that maybe that's just an example. We need more prevention tools to give people more options. What we have right now is not always going to be sufficient to make offers today.
I do just think that this question of engagement, how do we engage around prep access for partners is critical, because how do we engage, especially if somebody is involved, ensuring that the community has that. So I'm wondering also if you all think about what are things that advocates and community members can do to help talk about the ATI trials. What can help helpful on prep for partners to input on update or how to set them up?
I would say early engagement of the community and let them tell us. And the target or the groups that we're trying to reach, engage them before implementation and have them make the suggestions. Similarly, at Fresh, we provide, and it's part of the CRF, it says, now provide the ATI prep for partners information. And then we go through and they counsel it, zero uptake. Yeah. So I just, as a disclaimer, Fresh was really modeled after the Thai cohort in Bangkok, the acute cohort. And we also, like Thailand, engage in extreme confidentiality, where colleagues in the same program had no idea who was acute. And when they finally came together 7 years later, it's like, oh, you're an acute? You're an acute? And so we had such protection that we created a setting of HIV exclusion, where there's an abnormal amount of stigma and non-disclosure because we set it up that way, that it was so confidential. And that's not the norm in South Africa. There's a lot more increase in disclosure. But when you have that kind of setting where disclosure is possibly dangerous to participants, or you've allowed for such extreme confidentiality that now you're trying to work against the tide in order to get people to talk to their partners about a protection. So I would say engage early and ask the communities themselves, the participants themselves, how should we do this? Let them tell us.
And I mean, these are some of the issues I'm referring to. Let's say there will be a lot of ethical questions that will arise out of some of these hard questions. And you're not just talking about risk of partner violence. What about in countries where they prosecute transmission, HIV transmission? What about, so we'll have all these questions begin to emerge as we think about it. HIV, but what I really, I believe every person living with HIV does not want to ever affect their partner and do everything to protect them. And at least, I think as has been suggested here, to engage people and say, look, what strategies are you going to take to prevent transmission to your sexual partner or bisexual partners? And so, yeah, it's going to be a very difficult but very important conversation to have with our participants.
Great. So we're just, I know we're thinking about time. I'm going to do 2 more from online and then 2 in the room and then
I got it. So the one question is, during ATIs, in case of a reinitiation, how did you ensure a smooth transition between healthcare providers at the comprehensive care clinic without the participant being subjected to harsh treatments?
I think that's open to anybody.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I think kind of to Shelley's point, every site was working within whatever the bounds of its local healthcare system was. So they were obtaining the participants' consent to allow the research team to communicate with the primary healthcare provider and to enable that direct contact. But I really think it varied from site to site based on whatever the local healthcare setting was, because they're different from country to country. I don't recall hearing anything to suggest that there was any sort of harsh or stigmatizing kind of interaction. Shelley, you're nodding your head. I don't if you want to add, but I personally didn't hear anything of that kind, so I can't comment beyond that.
There was a little bit, but that took place at the beginning. So each site made sure that the primary HVA care providers were engaged in the consenting kind of discussion, knowing that their participant or that their patient was going on ATI. And there were a few cases where the provider was like, no way, not my patient, I can't support that. And ongoing dialogue actually turned that around. But it was consistent dialogue in the beginning and then sharing with the participant's permission, sharing data throughout the study so that they were fully informed. And when it came time to go back on ART, they had that dialogue and that relationship still established to prevent that.
Sweet. And so we had one other question that hasn't really come up. They were talking specifically about the inclusion of people who use drugs in ATI studies. Did you have any comment or?
So in the AMP studies, which was the parent to our ATI trial, that was actually exclusionary. The AMP studies were set up specifically to look at the particular vulnerability of sexual transmission. So in our ATI study, drug user, that was not a factor for us.
Okay.
Okay, and I'm gonna go with Brian.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to have a brief comment about the partner conversation and just remind us as a field that this is not the first time we've done this. We've got all of the partner studies leading up to the U equals U knowledge that we now have. You know, over 4,000 couples combined in HVTN 052, the 2 partner studies in opposites attract. And opposites attract in particular, I think, is a great model to look at the thoughtfulness that was put into the legal implications of 0 different couples participating in the clinical trial. So I just wanted to remind us that we do have some examples in our history to look to when we're considering this issue of partners.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you make a really good point. I think one of the things to also just think about when it comes to these ATI trials is the involvement in enrolling 2 people into a study versus the person in a curative study is not necessarily the person who is at risk of acquiring HIV, and therefore the issues around consent and monitoring are even more technically or have other challenges, which again reinforces that role of engagement of a variety of stakeholders and not necessarily just local communities. And I'm going to say, last question, I apologize, can you say your name one more time?
Andrew.
Andrew, thank you.
I'm just curious on partners and the data collected. Was there any data around sex workers and the impact of sex workers participants and all that on the ATI or AMP?
Shelley, do you? I personally am not familiar with that data set, so I don't know.
Do you know anything about the RB 144 around sex work?
Yeah.
So to date, as far as Richard, you correct me if I'm wrong, there's not been an ETI trial in a community of sex workers to date. So, and people may not have self-disclosed that.
Yeah, and I guess I also want to distinguish that, at least for the AMP study in Africa, a woman who was participating may have been doing sex work, and that would have been evaluated as part of an eligibility assessment to determine what that individual's vulnerability to acquiring HIV was. So it's possible that sex work was happening, but we don't necessarily have a data set to look at quote unquote sex workers because that specifically wasn't the criterion. So it's perhaps a little bit invisible in our data.
And I would just say we do ask in our behavioral assessment about exchange sex, but whether or not that's commercial, we don't qualify that. We just ask a general question about exchange sex.
So we have to wrap up, but I know this was a fantastic panel and a lot of discussion that can still happen. I just want to thank our fantastic panelists for
I'm not gonna run to you tonight. I'm I'm just gonna make my way to the city of light.